Bună ziua! Numele meu este Nicolae Ștefănuță, Nicu Ștefănuță, europarlamentar. Sunt aici în calitate de facilitator al acestui eveniment, al societății civile și presei românești.
And also to the organizers, the Romanian organizers, Asociația Civică Activag and Inițiativa Timișoara. So from Argeș and from Timișoara, the organizers decided to have this event here.
Those are the preconditions of a functioning democracy, and we can have very different ideas on, what a minimum salary should be, or how strict environmental legislation exactly should be. What we should not fight about, that we all have an interest that money we spend together actually goes where it's supposed to be and is not stolen on the way. And that there is an independent judiciary able to follow up on these things. So that's a fight. Obviously, we in the Parliament will continue, and that we hope that the European Commission in particular takes this more serious from here on out, and particularly also that the member states assume the role that they have on these questions, because whenever the rule of law, when the independence of judiciary becomes part of horse trading and deal making, then it can only lose, because you cannot compromise on the independence of justice. You cannot compromise in the fight against corruption. Otherwise, there is no fight against corruption.
Romania is a young democracy. It is a country where there is no rule of law culture. For a little while, we have been talking about European standards such as the separation of powers, independence of justice, non-discrimination, and freedom of expression. With every reform made, individuals want more freedom and the state wants more control. During communism, a person could have been a judge or prosecutor only with the approval of the Communist Party. This explains why justice was controlled at that time by politicians. There was not a constitutional court. The supreme judges were appointed by Parliament. The prosecutors were subordinated to Minister of Justice and were obliged to attend to meetings of local and party authorities. In fact,
maybe in Bulgaria, with protests and people taking to the streets and fighting against the corruption, huge protests. And by the way, now Bulgaria is a mess. I don't know if you're following what is happening, but Borisov came back to power after all of the protests and after they finally were able to get a government with a different political reality. Now they're back into chaos, more or less. But I think it's a fight not only because of the direction that the political will took and the way the politicians understood that the reform of the justice system should happen, but also because the system itself is very divided. Maybe because part of the system as well understands rule of law differently.
To push for this mechanism, to the conditionality, to hold back money. But in the end, what we want to achieve is not holding back money from Hungarians, where this mechanism is now in place. Or if Romania would develop in a different or in a very difficult direction, we don't want to hold back money from Romanians. We want to make sure that the rule of law is valid everywhere in Europe. And that's what we're trying to achieve. But we need to have also consequences and clear language and a clear position. And I think that was missing in Europe in the last years. But I think we have a real chance, and I'm proud that we might see tomorrow the first time that the Commission really is going forward and saying, let's hold back money to a EU member state. Thank you.
To the present now, what does Russia do now? We all know. What's the threat for countries like Romania? Well, if we remember correctly, it was 2019 or something like that. What was the biggest enemy of the state? Laura Codruța-Kövesi. She was the biggest enemy. She was the threat. She did everything bad. and all the TV networks were against her, and you couldn't see any news without something bad about Laura Codruța-Kövesi. She's now the head of the European Prosecutor's Office, and I don't know if you know it, but today they've just announced
the founding fathers of the American Revolution crafted a document for the worst of times and the worst of leaders. The founders wanted to create a system that did not depend on the good intentions or motivations of the rulers. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. So they created a system that contains a series of checks and balances to prevent the concentration and the abuse of power. But we know this is not the case with Romania. In Romania, the independence of the judicial system depends on who possesses the most important political position, who is the president, who is the prime minister, who is the minister of justice. In Romania, the majority of people support an independent judicial system. In the glory,
because we just ignored it, right? We thought that, well, democracy is like there and everybody is, on their way to like flourishing even further. We could not imagine that countries are backsliding. But this was the case, unfortunately, because we Europeans, we weren't there for these citizens. So our group, the Renew Europe group, and I have to say that Nicola, but also Ramona, have been amazing partners for fighting for a strong rule of law monitoring framework. So we have a strong rule of law oversight mechanism, a rule of law conditionality mechanism. We now have powers to put rule of law to the front of center of attention and to monitor what governments are doing, but also to be able to provide good examples and necessary oversight. Because for instance, when we are talking about the reform of justice,
I'm used to living in a well-functioning democracy where the rule of law is vital and where the laws apply to all. In comparison, I perceive that in Romania, the implementation of the rule of law is still work in progress. That concerns me, and it should concern us all, because any dysfunctionality in the judiciary system or in the applied principles of the state of law in any country of the European Union has a direct impact on all the other member states.
We live in troubled times, and I would like to conclude by saying that I hope that the common principles and values on which the European Union is based, freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law, do not turn into a utopia. And if that happens, the only ones to blame will be us, all of us. We'll be those children with dreams and feelings who have become adults with no future, somewhere on the periphery of Europe.
Taking advantage of the help offered by the instigator, we all know who is, of the education reform, they attempted to save all the other plagiarists and to dissolve the National Council for Attestation of University Titles, Diplomas and Certificates. Nevertheless, if you still had hope for the best, unfortunately, you are terribly wrong. In this process of destruction, the youth helplessly witnessed how even our petitions were ignored and the abuse of power that was conducted against our free will and interest.
Do not take investigative articles from Press Hub just because they fear, as Laura said before, they fear about local authorities. Sometimes it's fear, other times it's complicity. It's a kind of complicity with local authorities. They take money from local authorities and they are having very nice life in this kind of complicity. So if you are going to support independent media in Romania, I think you should look first at the editorial content. It's very easy to decide which media is independent and which not.
So, hundreds of articles have been written about this toxic practice of grey financing the press by political parties outside the election campaigns using public funds. It happened since few years ago, if I remember. This practice is so widespread, both in the central and local media, that the
the key role of this media as the watchdog of democracy, this role has been practically entirely cancelled.
This is a very nice photo. Somebody put it on a building. Știrile mint când banii vorbesc. The news lies when money speaks. So this is my conclusion.
Justice also failed to be done after the 10th of August 2018, when hundreds of thousands of peaceful citizens were gassed and beaten up by the Romanian gendarmerie simply for protesting against corrupt politicians who are trying to forward changes in the judicial systems, aiming to sabotage its efficiency. Justice failed again after Collective, the tragedy that killed 65 people, some in the flames, but most of them in Romania's rotten hospitals.